Good day, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 3 in our Microeconomics course. In today's lecture, we are going to study one of the most important topics in the consumer theory, namely indifference curve analysis, and also known as the ordinal utility approach. In previous lectures, we discussed how consumers make choices using the concept of utility. We learned that economists initially believed utility could be measured numerically through what is called the cardinal utility approach. However, economists later realized that measuring satisfaction with exact numbers is unrealistic because satisfaction is a personal feeling that cannot be measured precisely. Today's lecture introduces a more realistic way of explaining consumer behavior. So instead of assuming that consumers measure utility, we assume that they simply compare different alternatives and rank them according to their preferences. Now let me define ordinal utility more formally. Ordinal utility means that consumers are able to arrange or rank different combinations of goods according to their preferences. Notice something very important. Consumers do not measure satisfaction. They simply compare alternatives. Let me use an example. Suppose a consumer has 3 bundles of goods. Bundle A, Bundle B, and Bundle C. Bundle A contains 5 apples and 2 oranges. Bundle B contains 3 apples and 4 oranges. Bundle C contains 2 apples and 1 orange. So after comparing these bundles, the consumer ranked them as A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C. So mathematically, A is greater than B in its utility. That means that the utility derived from A is larger than the utility derived from B. Also, the utility derived from B is larger than the utility derived from C. So we simply know the consumer prefers one bundle over another. And this is exactly how people making decision every day. Consumer preferences form the foundation of the entire ordinal theory. So before economists can analyze consumer choices, they must first understand what consumers like and dislikes. Consumer preferences simply describe how individuals compare different bundles of goods. So whenever consumers face different alternatives, they make one of the 3 feasible decisions. They may prefer one bundle over another. For example, look to this table. He may prefer bundle A over bundle B or to bundle B. Or they may prefer bundle B to bundle A, or they may prefer bundle B to C, or whatever it is. So they may be completely indifferent between the 2 bundles. So the word indifferent doesn't mean consumer doesn't care. It doesn't mean consumer doesn't care. Instead, it means both bundles provide the same level of satisfaction. If I offer you 2 combinations of food that satisfy you equally, you have no reason to choose one over the other. It means that you are indifferent between them. So this idea becomes extremely important because it leads directly to the concept of the indifference curve. The indifference curve is simply a graphical representation of all combinations of two goods that provide the same level of satisfaction. It means that the consumer preferences can be represented visually or graphically, and this makes it much easier for economists to analyze consumer choices. What do we mean by indifference curve? Now that we understand the concept of ordinal utility and consumer preferences, so we are ready to study or to learn what do we mean by indifference curve. And this is one of the most important models in microeconomics. Before this theory was developed, economists relied on the cardinal utility approach. As I told you before, the cardinal utility approach assumed that consumers could measure satisfaction in numerical units called utils. Although this idea was useful, it had one major weakness. No one can actually measure satisfaction with numbers. To solve this problem, the economists John Hicks and R.G. Allen developed the theory of indifference curve analysis in 1930, and their approach is based on a much more realistic assumption. Instead of measuring satisfaction, consumers simply compare different alternatives and rank them according to their preferences. So the main objective of this theory is to explain how consumers can rank or allocate their limited income among different goods in order to achieve the highest possible level of satisfaction. As I told you that the term indifference curve may sound complicated at first, but the idea behind it is actually quite simple. An indifference curve is a curve that shows all possible combinations of two goods that provide the consumer with the same level of satisfaction or utility. It means that every point on the curve is equally attractive to the consumer. Look to this table. We have an example of an indifference curve. Let us examine the table shown on this slide. We have three different combinations of two goods, which we call good X and good Y. We have good X and good Y. This is good X and this is good Y. Combination A contains 8 units of good X and 2 units of good Y, and combination B contains 6 units of good X and 3 units of good Y, while combination C contains 4 units of good X and 5 units of good Y. Although these combinations contain different quantities of each good, they all provide the consumer with exactly the same level of satisfaction. That is why they all lie on the same indifference curve. Look here to the graph or indifference curve. We have all the combinations A, B, and C, and they provide the same level of satisfaction. This is commodity A and this is commodity C or X. As the quantity of good X decreases, the quantity of good Y increases, and I'm going to explain this in the coming lectures. Why the consumer is indifferent? The economic reasoning behind that indifference curve is that when the consumer moves from one point to another on the same indifference curve, two things happen simultaneously. The consumer gains more of one good, or the consumer gives up some quantity of the other good. At first, this may seem like a loss. However, the increase in satisfaction obtained from consuming more of one good is exactly balanced by the decrease in satisfaction resulting from consuming less of the other good. As a result, the consumer's total satisfaction remains unchanged. This is the meaning of the word indifferent. Or it means that consumers compare combinations of goods rather than measuring utility. So an indifference curve represents combinations that provide equal satisfaction. Let me come to the assumptions of the indifference curve analysis. Before economists can use any model to explain the human behavior, they must first make certain assumptions. And these assumptions simplify reality and allow us to analyze consumer decisions systematically. So the theory of the indifference curve analysis is based on several important assumptions. The first assumption is that consumers are rational. And a rational consumer is someone who makes decisions logically and consistently. It means that consumers aim to obtain the highest possible satisfaction from their available income. It means that they compare alternatives before making a decision rather than choosing randomly. The second assumption is that consumers seek to maximize satisfaction. And since their income is limited, consumers try to spend their money in a way that gives them the greatest overall benefit. They do not simply buy the largest quantity of goods. Instead, they choose a combination of goods that provides the highest level of utility. The third assumption is that preferences are complete. And this means that consumers are always able to compare any two bundles of goods. Either he prefers A to B, or prefer B to A, or he is indifferent between A and B. And the fourth assumption is that transitive. Preferences are transitive. This means that if you have three bundles, A, B, and C, and if you prefer A to B and you prefer B to C, this means that you prefer A to C. The fifth assumption is non-satiation assumption, and over-summarized as more is better than less. More is better than less. If two bundles differ only because one contains more of at least one good, without reducing the quantity of the other, consumers will always prefer the larger bundle. For example, 5 bottles of water are generally preferred to 3 bottles if every else remains the same. The sixth assumption is that goods are divisible. What do we mean by this? This means goods can be consumed in small units or fractions. For example, consumers can buy half a kilogram of rice or 1/4 of a liter of milk. And this assumption makes graphical analysis more easier. The seventh assumption is that consumer tastes remain constant during the period of analysis. In other words, preferences do not suddenly change while consumers are making their decisions. The eighth assumption is that income is fixed. Consumers are assumed to make decisions with a given amount of budget. Finally, market prices are given. It means that consumers cannot influence prices. Instead, they accept market prices and make purchasing decisions accordingly. These decisions provide the foundation upon which the entire indifference curve analysis is built. Properties of the indifference curve. Understanding these properties help us interpret consumer behavior correctly. And let us discuss them one by one. The first property is that indifference curve is sloped downward from left to right. Why this is case? Because a consumer gives up some quantity of good Y. If satisfaction is to remain unchanged, the consumer must receive more of good X. If the curve were upward sloping, it would imply that consumers receive more of both goods while remaining equally satisfied. And this contradicts the assumption that more goods provide greater satisfaction. Therefore, indifference curve must slope downward. The second property is that indifference curves are convex to the origin, and this convex shape reflects the law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Instead, when consumers have very little of good X, they are willing to sacrifice a large quantity of Y to obtain one more unit of good X. However, as they consume more and more of good X, each additional unit becomes less valuable relative to good Y. Consequently, they become less willing to give up good Y. This gradual reduction in willingness to substitute one good for another creates the convex shape. The third property is that higher curve represents higher satisfaction. The curve farther from the origin contain combinations with larger quantities of one or both goods. We're going to see this in the indifference map in the coming slides. Since more goods generally provide greater utility, these higher curves represent greater satisfaction. The fourth property is that indifference curves never intersect. Imagine two indifference curves crossing. At the intersection point, the consumer would receive the same satisfaction from both curves. However, other points on those curves would imply contradictory preferences ranking, and this violates the assumption of transition. Therefore, two indifference curves can never cross each other. The last, or finally, indifference curve are thin curves. Each curve represents only one level of utility. If the curve had thickness, different levels of satisfaction would exist within the same curve, creating confusion. Let us come to indifference map. We have focused in the previous slides on a single indifference curve. However, one curve represents only one level of satisfaction, but consumers actually have many possible levels of utility. To represent all these possibilities, economists use an indifference map. An indifference map is simply a collection of many indifference curves. Each curve represents a different level of satisfaction. Together, these curves provide a complete picture of the consumer's preferences. Let me move to the curve. So this is an indifference map. You can observe that there are three indifference curves labeled IC1, IC2, and IC3. IC1 is closer to the origin, therefore it represents the lowest level of satisfaction. IC2 lies farther from the origin, it represents the higher level of utility, while IC3 is the farthest from the origin. Consequently, it represents the highest level of satisfaction among the three indifference curves. Why does satisfaction increase as we move away from the origin? Because each higher curve contains combinations with greater quantities of one or both goods. And according to the assumption of non-satiation, consumers prefer more goods to fewer goods. Therefore, higher curves represent greater utility. Let us come to a new concept, marginal rate of substitution. Now that you understand indifference curves and indifference maps, we can introduce one of the most important concepts in consumer theory, the marginal rate of substitution, commonly abbreviated as MRS. So to understand this concept, imagine you enjoy both coffee and tea. Suppose I offer you one additional cup of coffee. Would you be willing to give up one cup of tea in exchange? Most people would say yes, but what if I ask you to give up 5 cups of tea? You might refuse. This simple example illustrates the idea behind the marginal rate of substitution. The MRS measures how much of one good a consumer is willing to give up in order to obtain one additional unit of another good while keeping the same level of satisfaction. Mathematically, we can get it as delta y divided by delta x, which means the change that we give up from y and increases in x. Okay, let me illustrate the marginal rate of substitution and the diminishing marginal rate of substitution using a table. The law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution, often abbreviated as DMRS, explains how consumers' willingness to substitute one good for another changes over time. The law states that as a consumer requires more of one good and less of another, the amount of the second good that consumer is willing to give up for an additional unit of the first good gradually decreases while maintaining the same level of satisfaction. Suppose you have 1 bottle of water but 10 chocolate bars. At this point, water is relatively scarce, so you may be willing to give up several chocolate bars to obtain another bottle of water. Look to the table. We have different combinations of apple, orange, and orange given up. From 15 to 11, we give up 4. From 11 to 8, we give up 3. From 8 to 6, we give up 2. And from 6 to 5, we give up 1. So the marginal rate of substitution between orange and apple is 4, 3, 2, 1. Understand? So moving from A to B, the consumer give up 4 orange. Give up 4 oranges for 1 additional apple. Moving from B to C, the consumer give up 3 oranges for additional 1 from apple, and so on. This shows that the marginal rate of substitution decreases as the consumer acquires more apple because it declines from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. Now you have the class quiz. Every student has to revise what he has been learned from this lecture using this class quiz or solving this class quiz. I encourage you to review today's lecture before moving on. Today we introduce you to the ordinal utility approach without measuring utility. We learned that consumers rank alternatives according to their preferences, and these preferences can be represented graphically using indifference curves and indifference maps. We also discussed the assumptions and properties of indifference curves and introduced the concept of the marginal rate of substitution and explained why the law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution gives indifference curves. This characteristics convex shape. In the next lecture, we will build on these concepts by introducing the budget line and showing how consumers reach equilibrium where they maximize satisfaction subject to their income constraint. Thank you for your attention. I encourage you to review the lecture, practice the quiz questions, and attempt additional exercises before our next class. I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Have a wonderful day.